Chapter 1. Tuesday, October 19, Sup/Sup, 1852. I cannot believe we're almost back to Clover Creek. We've been walking since March, and I'm exhausted, but soon we will be in our new home, and we will be able to build our houses and businesses, and start living and not just trying to reach a destination so we can begin our lives. The journey has been long and hard. My mother passed on the way between Oregon City and Clover Creek, and I've taken over the cooking from her. Thankfully, all my brothers are older than I am, and I do not have to worry about taking care of them like some of the other young ladies who lost their mothers. The excitement filling the camp today is filling me with delight for the first time since my mother died along the way. My father is still fulfilling his duties as captain, but soon it will no longer be necessary. Eventually, our little community may need a mayor, but that will be down the road. Pa is planning to start a ranch there near the creek where he chose his plot of land. I know he is having difficulties with losing Ma, but I have a feeling he will be able to do all he needs to do anyway. Pa is one of those people who just keeps going and going. We should reach Clover Creek before noon today, and we will all find our exact plots of land, and then we will start building a community. I do wish we'd had a bit more time for me to get up the courage to talk to Roy Williams. I have had my eye on him since we first started on the trail. He never once asked me to dance, though I do wish he had. Henrietta Appleby, the youngest of Jacob Appleby's children, stretched to get the kinks out from sleeping on the ground for so long, and then she walked to the fire to start breakfast for her father and 3 older brothers. Each of her brothers had gotten their own plot of land, but she would be living with her father. At 18, she'd been too young to get her own plot of land without being married. If she'd been married, she and her husband could have each gotten one. But you had to be 21 to stake a claim if you were unmarried. Henrietta didn't mind, but she did think her own land would make her more appealing to potential suitors, of which she hoped Roy would be at the head of the line. Never in her life had she so badly wanted to go up to a man and ask him to court her, but she knew it would be unacceptable behavior. Her mother had always told her she needed to chase a man until he caught her, which seemed like good advice, but it was considered forward to chase a man, and she didn't think seeming forward would be a good idea. Roy was on the trail with his own parents and 3 younger sisters, and she knew he'd staked his own claim. So, he was over 21, and not married yet. If there was just a way, she could get him to talk to her. But all day, he drove his own wagon. Some of the essentials that his parents needed were in the back of his wagon as well, and he was an integral part of the Williams family making it to Clover Creek. After making Johnny cakes for breakfast, she woke her father and brothers, who all preferred to get the last minute of sleep they could and then rush through their chores before they pulled out of camp for the day. Her brothers had each brought their own wagon, but they tended to park theirs right beside their father's so they could eat the meals her mother had cooked, and now the meals she cooked. When they'd all relieved themselves, they joined her at the small fire she'd made for their meal. They'd loaded up on as many supplies as possible as they'd gone through Soda Springs again, and most of them felt they were going to be ready for winter if they had roofs over their heads. Henri, as her family called her, knew her father planned on a simple cabin for the first winter, but if he had time, he would build a real house during the warmer months. Her brothers all had the same plans, and she thought it would be good if they found wives, but not one of them seemed to think they should until they were established in Clover Creek. She had to wonder if Roy felt the same. His sisters were close to her age, but she'd never sought them out to walk beside them. Usually she'd walked alongside her mother, and they'd chatted along the way. She knew the Williams sisters were the same. They stuck together and walked with their mother as they moved along. Her brothers were all eating when Henri decided she would walk with Roy's family that day. She'd taken to walking with Jane and Sarah most days, helping them look over the children as she did, but she was going to do something new that day. If she could make friends with his sisters, perhaps they could see one another even after they'd settled. "I think you should save the breakfast dishes for tonight when we're camped on our own property." The creek will provide all the water you need for your chores, Pa said. Henri nodded. I can do that. It sounds a great deal more pleasant than trying to do them before we leave this morning. I haven't gotten water from the river yet this morning. I told your brothers they should be carrying your water for you. Pa looked between Jared, Samuel, and Sebastian. Have you not been doing as you were told? Jared shrugged. I thought Sam and Bastian were doing it. Sam sighed. I thought Jared and Bastian were doing it. Pa looked at Bastian. I guess you thought your brothers were doing it as well? Bastian nodded, grinning. Bastian was always in a jovial mood. He had been Henri's favorite brother since she was tiny. He was the youngest of her brothers, so it made sense she was closest to him. I manage, Pa. She didn't want to make a big deal out of the work she did for her family. It was women's work after all. Yes, you manage, but you are cooking for the three of them, and they need to show you some respect. You could start refusing to cook for any of them, and just cook for the two of us. Then where would they be? Hungry, Henrietta said with a grin. I'm serious about this. If your brothers don't bring you water and firewood once we get to Clover Creek, then you will stop cooking for them. They need to be thankful for all you do for them as the only woman in the family left. Pa shook his head. I feel like they are taking advantage of your kindness. Yes, Pa. Henri knew she'd sneak food to her brothers if it came to that. They could be a pain in her backside, but she loved them all. We should be in Clover Creek by noon. I want to go to our property and start building that log cabin. You boys will help me build one with a loft for Henri and me, and then I'll help you with yours. It would be smart if you three could share a cabin this winter and then build your own when it warms up, but that's up to you, and I'll help with whatever you decide to build. I don't want to have to worry about sharing a house with my brothers when I start courting. We had a lot of pretty girls for traveling companions. Jared, the eldest, said. Henri was startled to realize her brothers were thinking of starting to court girls before winter, but in a way, it made sense to her. She had no desire to settle into a cabin with her pa and then have to move everything later. After walking 2,000 miles, she felt like she wanted to be done moving for a while. Do you already have your eye on someone? Henri asked, not expecting a real answer. Emma Williams. She's the prettiest girl available, so I need to move in quickly to get her to realize I'm the person she wants to marry. Henri frowned. Did all men want to marry the prettiest girl? With her brown hair and dark eyes, she knew she wasn't the prettiest girl around, but she hoped her delicate features made up for her coloring. Henri looked between Samuel and Bastian. Do you two have girls in mind? Both brothers shook their heads. I'm waiting till spring, Bastian said. That's when all the animals find mates. I'll follow their lead. Henrietta laughed. Bastian was ridiculous. Sam shrugged. I'll wait, but not necessarily try to find someone in spring. When the right girl comes along, I'll know it. And are you both looking for the prettiest girls? Bastian looked thoughtful for a moment. Some things are more important than how a girl looks. Like cooking. You cook like a dream. I'd marry you if you weren't my sister. Henri shook her head, laughing. So, all that matters is a girl who can cook? It doesn't matter if she's not pretty? Not as much as whether she can cook. I'd rather not have to put a bag over her head to make babies, of course, but I will if I need to. Bastian. We do not talk about things like that with women, Pa glowered at Bastian. Sam half-grinned. I agree with Bastian that there's more to marriage than how pretty a girl is. I want someone I can have real conversations with. Someone that doesn't mind helping with the chores and will be a good mother. Sometimes pretty girls are the worst candidates for a wife because they think everything is beneath them. As she listened to her brothers discuss what they wanted in a wife, Henri's insecurities grew by leaps and bounds. Was she the kind of woman any man would want to marry? So, what happens to the girls who aren't really pretty, and who don't cook well or care to take on ranch chores? Bastian looked at her for a moment, before throwing his head back and laughing. You're worried you won't get married. That's hilarious. You're prettier than Emma Williams, by far. We all just have to keep overlooking you, because you're our sister. Trust me, it won't be long before Pa has a line at his door filled with men who want to court you. Henri stood up and tucked the dishes back into the back of the wagon. Bastian's compliment was nice, but it wasn't enough. She needed to hear something like that from a male who wasn't her brother. Bastian followed her to the wagon and asked in a whisper, "Who do you have your eye on?" Henri blushed, looking at him. "Why do you think I have my eye on someone?" "Because you've never cared about being pretty or the best at chores and cooking. I can see right on your face there's a boy you're sweet on." Henri bit her lip as she thought about telling her brother who it was, and finally, after some contemplation, she whispered, "Roy Williams." She hoped he wouldn't laugh at her. She truly wanted his approval. Bastian nodded. "He's a good man. I like the idea of you marrying him. Don't tell anyone." She would hate it if it got all over camp that she was setting her cap for Roy. "I wouldn't. Though, I may try to play matchmaker for the two of you. I need a way to entertain myself." With that, Bastian headed off to get the oxen he needed for his wagon. They'd brought more oxen than anyone else around, but they planned to build a huge ranch, with all four of the men working together. Henri wanted to run after her brother and tell him in no uncertain terms that she didn't want him to interfere, but she didn't want to be seen running, which would look unladylike. But more than that, she knew if she told her brother to keep his nose out of her business, he would be all the more determined. She decided not to make the effort to walk with Roy's sisters and mother that day. It would seem like she had instigated her brother talking to Roy if she did. And while she had told him who she had set her cap for, she hadn't wanted him to talk to him. Not at all. Soon, they were back on the trail for their last day. Their beautiful home would be able to be seen over the next mountain. They all walked up, and then she saw it. The beautiful valley that almost the entire company had decided to settle in. Clover Creek, where every day would be wonderful. Henri couldn't wait to sleep on her father's land that night. It was just before noon that the entire party stopped near the creek. Pa walked out into the middle of the wagons, where he could be heard by everyone. "We've all put in a great deal of work to get here, to our new home. I want to thank all of you for coming along this journey with us. I know we've lost more than our share of people along the way, and we will always miss those who have gone before us as a result of this journey. We will always mourn with you." He turned to the pastor who was standing close. "Pastor Scott? Would you thank God for his mercies in bringing us to our destination?" Jed stepped forward and bowed his head, praying for the people they'd lost along the way, and asking for them to be forever in their hearts. And he prayed the community would be blessed with good people and bountiful crops and livestock. When he'd finished, there was a loud resounding amen that carried throughout the valley. Pa said, "As your captain, I thank you once again for the journey, and I pray we all have wonderful lives starting from this day forward. My family and I claimed the land at the top of that hill." He pointed to a large hill, which was very close. "If you need help, come see us, and we'll be happy to oblige. I hope the rest of you feel the same. We've journeyed so far together that it would be terrible to lose the friendships we've forged along the way." George Bedwell stepped forward. "You're going to need help making it up that hill there. Would you allow us to be part of your homecoming?" Pa looked at the former captain before nodding. "We would appreciate any help you'd be willing to give us." Henri couldn't believe Mr. Bedwell had been the one to offer to help them get their things up the hill. He'd not been the most pleasant man in the beginning, but his wife Katie had taught him a great deal about love and being kind to others. Many of the men gathered to unload some of the belongings from the back of each of the wagons, so that they wouldn't be too heavy to make it up the hill. And then they started their slow ascent. Henri was surprised when Roy fell into step beside her. "Are you excited to have the most coveted property in the whole settlement?" he asked. "Why is it the most coveted?" "Because of the view. I think your pa should put your house right there on that little plateau. That way you can watch the town grow as you do your dishes." She smiled. "That does sound wonderful. Would you say you'd be welcome to having a suitor come to see you whenever he had the chance?" Roy asked, surprising her. Henri felt her throat constrict. What had Bastien said to him? She nodded, not sure how to speak any longer. This was a day she'd been hoping for since March. "Good. I'll talk to your pa about it. I've had my eye on you since independence." "You have?" It made no sense. Why hadn't he asked her to dance? Or to walk with him? "Of course," he said, smiling down at her. "Why haven't you approached me before now, then?" she asked, wondering the whole time if she was being too pushy by asking. "Because we weren't at our destination. I couldn't have lived through losing you on that horrible journey." She looked over at him to see if he looked serious. "Really? Really? Then please, talk to my father. I would feel privileged to be courted by you. I know one of my brothers wants to court your sister Emma now that we're here. Perhaps our children will have double cousins." He reached down to grasp her hand. "Do you mind?" "Not even a little." They were breathing heavily by the time they'd reached the top of the steep hill, but nothing was lost. As her father and brothers headed down the hill for the things they'd taken out so they could make it up the hill, she started gathering wood for their fire. Roy was beside her the entire time, and when they'd brought enough firewood and kindling for a few days, he said, "I'll get you a bucket of water as well. Then I'll be off to start my ranch." "Where is your land?" she asked. "Just at the base of this hill," he told her. Henri smiled. "Then it won't be too hard for you to come and talk to my father later. I know he didn't see us holding hands, but I also know he's heard by now. He won't be happy if you don't talk to him and make it official that we're courting." "Happy to do that, and no, it won't be difficult at all. If all goes well, I'd like to be married by winter." She glanced at him and blushed. "I think that sounds lovely." Chapter 2. Tuesday, October 19, Sup/Sup, 1852. Today has been a truly glorious day. We made it to Clover Creek, and I was approached by the brother of the girl I've had my eye on since independence, Missouri. He told me that he thought his sister and I would make a great couple. I'd already planned to approach Henrietta as soon as we got to Clover Creek, but I would have probably waited another day or two. I'll go see her pa in the morning after my chores, and I'll ask if I may court her. For now, I'm living on the land my father was granted, but I will be building a one-room cabin quickly. I'm glad our families ended up settling so close together, and I hope her father accepts me as a prospective suitor for her. I will probably stop my journal entries after this one. There is no need to continue since this was my trail diary, and we're no longer moving along the trail, though we are living on it. It will seem odd not to write a journal entry every day, and I must admit, I enjoyed doing it once I'd started. I hope my days will now be spent building my cabin, taking care of livestock, and courting my lovely Henrietta. It is very clear she likes the idea as much as I do. On Wednesday morning, Roy did his morning chores, including milking the cows and gathering eggs. He thought gathering eggs was women's work, so he wasn't sure why he was expected to do it instead of his sisters. But Pa said it was his job, and he wasn't about to disobey his father. He didn't care how old he was. He took the milk to the spot where his mother and sisters had dubbed their kitchen, which he found downright silly. Their kitchen consisted of a barrel of rainwater and a campfire. He and his father would build a bench and a table soon, and then they had to get started on the cabin. There was frost on the ground as he woke that morning, and he knew it wouldn't be long before they had snow. Perhaps this wasn't the best spot to move to in autumn. Either way, it was their land, and they would make the most of it. After breakfast, he told his pa he needed to run up the hill for a moment, but he wouldn't be gone long. He couldn't be. There were trees to fell and use for making the cabin, and they had 2 cabins to make in a relatively short time. You'd better hurry back. We're digging a cellar today, and it's not going to be easy work. Roy nodded. I won't be long at all, and we'll get that cellar dug. Do I need a cellar for my cabin, or will Ma give me a little space for storing my own food? Of course, your Ma will give you space. Hurry. After his second instruction to hurry, Roy hurried up the hill as fast as he could. Even after all those months of driving, climbing a hill that steep was difficult. Once he reached the top, he slowed a bit until he caught his breath, and then he ran over to the spot where Henrietta had built a fire the day before. The family was still eating when he arrived, but he knew he couldn't wait for them to finish before talking to her pa. He had to get back. May I speak with you for a moment, Captain? Mr. Appleby gave him a strange look. We're not on the trail anymore, boy. It's Mr. Appleby now. May I speak with you? Mr. Appleby shrugged. Have at it. Alone, please? Roy didn't want to have this conversation with her brothers watching, and he certainly didn't want to have it in front of Henrietta. Mr. Appleby sighed. This had better be important. You're taking me from one of my daughter's meals, and she's even more skilled at cooking than her mother was. He got to his feet and walked away from the campfire a bit. What is it? Roy took a deep breath, trying to ignore Mr. Appleby's gruff attitude. I want to ask your permission to court Henrietta. Henri? I thought you declared you were courting her when you held her hand as we were climbing this hill yesterday. Roy sighed. She told me you'd know, and I needed to ask you as soon as possible. Henri was right. You should have asked me to court her before you ever touched her. Mr. Appleby looked him up and down. My boys have said good things about you, so I'll say yes. You may court her. Thank you, sir. May I come by this evening after my pa and I have finished the work we have planned for the day? You may. I want the 2 of you to be always within my sight or the sight of one of her brothers. You hear me? Yes, sir. I will do that with no problem. Now, I must get back down the hill. My pa and I are digging a cellar today. Are you building your own cabin? Mr. Appleby asked. As soon as we finish the one for my family, Roy said. Good. My girl does not need to be courted for a long time. Just get it done. I will. With that, Roy hurried down the hill to his father, who had only shoveled one clump of dirt. He had squared off the area to dig with some sticks and some thread. Roy grabbed his own shovel and started digging. You courting that Appleby girl? Pa asked. Roy nodded. I am. I had to ask her father for permission. You should have done that before you held her hand yesterday. I know. I knew it at the time, but I planned to ask to court her the first chance I got. Her pa said you could court her? He did. I'm thankful. I've had my eye on her for a while. Shoulda asked her on the trail when we had weekly dances. Then you coulda walked at night and danced with her. Weren't thinking ahead, were you? I guess not. I just wanted to be here, so we could court and marry quick. Do you think the captain will let you marry her quick? He told me not to draw things out, so I guess he will. Roy had dug twice as much as his father at that point, and no longer felt guilty for leaving. They worked steadily through the day and had a 5.5-foot cellar built by the time they were ready to finish for the day. Are you sure this is deep enough, Pa? It'll only be your ma and sisters coming down here, and none of them is over 5'4". It's going to be just fine. So tomorrow the floors, And then we start walling it in on Friday? Pa nodded. And we must remember that instead of working here on Sunday, we're all building the church. It'll be a log church, but there will be a building to worship in come winter. How long do you think the cabin will take us? Probably a couple of weeks if we work hard and work fast, which we'll do. And then we'll work on yours. There will be no digging into partially frozen ground for yours, and it'll be done quickly. If you stay with us while we work on it, it won't be so bad to wait that long. All right. I think we just need to do it then. He was already imagining bringing his beautiful bride home to the cabin they'd build. Every log would be placed with love. I know we do. And your sisters are on milking and eggs. I need you working every minute you can with me. Pa stretched, his back aching from the work they'd put in. Your ma should have supper ready. This is the only night that will mean the end of our workday. Go visit your gal tonight, but let her know tomorrow you'll be working from sunup to sundown. You can see her after it's dark if that's what you want to do. At that moment, he wanted to collapse, but he would go see Henrietta, or Henri as her family called her. He'd said he would, and he wouldn't go back on his promise. Besides, he couldn't wait to see her and hold her hand again. I'll let her know. Maybe she and I can take a lunch together or something. You decide. Pa led the way to the campfire where the girls were all working on their meal. It's just about ready, Ma said. It's just a stew, but I think it will be hearty enough to warm you up and give you the strength to work more tomorrow. That's all we need, Roy said, collapsing onto the ground. He and his pa needed to make them a table yet. But it probably wouldn't happen until after the cabin was built. And hopefully not until after his cabin was built as well. They could make furniture all winter. As soon as they finished supper, Roy stood and hurried up the hill to the campfire there. The Appleby family had just finished eating. May I take your daughter for a walk, Mr. Appleby? Yes, but stay within sight of us. If you can't see us, then you've gone too far. Yes, sir. Henrietta stood, and they walked together, making a huge circle around her family's campfire. I hate that my family feels the need to watch every step we take, she said in a whisper. I'm sure I'll do the same for our daughters, he said. I know it sounds like I'm jumping the gun, but I really am courting you with an intent to marry. She smiled at him. That would make me happy as well. Good. Then I know why I'm working so hard. He squeezed her hand. For a moment he wished that her whole family wasn't watching them, and he could kiss her, but he was pretty sure it would be a problem. I must start working sunup to sundown tomorrow. Pa and I dug an entire cellar today. Tomorrow we'll be chopping down trees for their floor and building a hatch over stairs to get to the cellar. And then we'll start the outer walls. With both of us working together, we should be able to get it done in a couple of weeks, and then we'll start on my cabin. I won't have a cellar, but Ma will let me store food in hers. He was giving her this information because she would be the one cooking. How will your pa do without you there to cook and clean? Henrietta shrugged. I guess I'll run up the hill and cook for him for 2 or 3 days, and then go back and do it all again. I should be able to have food ready for him for each meal, just by running up a couple of days per week. He can eat the same things over and over. While food is cooking, I can clean the house. That sounds like a good plan. Have you talked to your pa about it? I mentioned it, but he said he'd cook for himself, and I needed to focus on you once we're married. I've never once seen him cook, but with Ma gone, it's going to be different. He'll need to learn to fix some basic dishes. Probably. But I wouldn't mind you helping him out. At least until the children come. His mind was filled with the idea of making the babies, and not having them, but he didn't think that made him a bad person. He had the prettiest girl he'd ever met standing beside him. I like the idea of having children with you. In her mind, she was holding a tiny babe and feeding him, Oh, she loved the idea of having his child. Would your father disown you and refuse to let me ever see you again if I kissed you? He asked, keeping his voice soft so as not to be heard. I think he probably would. And then he'd send my brothers to hunt you down and kill you. He's a bit overprotective. He only had one girl, you see. I understand. What would you say to me kissing you if he wasn't here? I would ask you to wait until we'd been courting longer. Sorry. I feel like a lady shouldn't kiss so quickly. He sighed. I suppose you're right. He thought for a moment, trying to come up with something to say after that. Do you prefer to be called Henrietta or Henri? She smiled. Henri has always been a special nickname my family uses. I'd rather everyone doesn't call me Henri, but it would be nice to hear it from your lips. I'll have to call you Henri then. Though Roy marrying Henri doesn't sound like it should be possible. Henri giggled. No, it does not. He grinned. Well, considering my father and I dug a cellar today, I should get to my bed, or ground. I don't know when I can see you again. My father is insisting we spend all of our time building, as I'm sure your father is as well. He is, but not me, of course. Only the boys. If I don't see you before then, I'll see you on Sunday during the church raising. She nodded. That should be a fun day. We'll all work together to build a cabin large enough to worship in. I think the pastor and Hannah plan to spend the winter in the church. I wouldn't be surprised. He squeezed her hand tightly. I'll see you then, but if I can get away, I'll see you before. Maybe I'll pop down and surprise you. Taking him some cookies or a sandwich or two would be an excuse to see him. And she'd just perfected making cookies over a campfire. I'd love that, he said, smiling at her. With that, he hurried away down the hill and to his bed. It was going to be a long couple of weeks of building if he couldn't see Henri. When he woke the following morning, Roy shivered and stood up, doing a few jumping jacks to get his body moving. He found gloves and grabbed an axe. Everyone else was still sleeping, but he could see well enough to chop down a few trees. Perhaps his father would let him escape a little early if he worked hard before the others woke. His father joined him within 30 minutes. Your mother is making breakfast while your sisters gather the eggs and milk the cows. I thought I'd join you while I wait for them to call us for breakfast. Let's see how many trees we can cut down. He'd already cut 2. And they were big, long trees they could get plenty of logs out of. The two of them worked in relative silence. The only sound being the whack of their axes against the tree trunks. They had 6 trees around them when his mother called them to breakfast. Sitting for breakfast, he looked at his 3 sisters. He'd heard several men say that Emma was the prettiest girl in camp, but he just didn't see it. Henrietta was far prettier as far as he was concerned. Abigail was his second sister, and she wasn't as pretty and a great deal more studious. She was 16 and had never really had a beau, which he thought was a good thing. None of his sisters had beaux though. He and his father had managed to chase all the young men away. His youngest sister was Barbara, and she was very flighty in his opinion. She was interested in one thing and then another. She couldn't focus on any one thing, but at 12, he couldn't really expect her to. His mind was filled with Henri as they ate and thinking about how much progress they could make on the cabin that day. So much work had to be done, but it was important that it was finished quickly. Halfway through the meal, he looked at his paw. Why don't we have Barbara help us with the work today? I think she could be a big help with packing the mud between the logs that will make the floor. Barbara wrinkled her nose. That's men's work. Pa looked at Barbara. Your brother's right. You can spend the day helping us along with Abigail. There's too much to do to call anything women's work and men's work. Right now, it's all work, and it must be done quickly. Though Roy knew his sisters were angry with him, he didn't care. They'd save half a day's work, with the two girls helping. Any time they could save was good time. Ma nodded. Yes, I think that sounds good. After Emma and I finish the dishes and get something cooking for our noon meal, we'll join you. Many hands make the work light. Emma glared at Roy then. He smiled back at her sweetly. Having all four of them helping meant they could get the job done without the help of the men. Then he and his father could spend the entire day chopping down trees. They would get a great deal more done with all of them working together. The floor was mostly in place by the time they sat down for their noon meal, which was potato soup. Roy had always been particularly fond of the soup because it was warm and filled him up, but not making him so full he couldn't work. After lunch, he and his father worked on the logs, while the ladies all worked on packing the floor. He was sure they could help chink the cabins as well, taking days off the amount of time it would take to build the cabins. While they were working, he caught a movement out of the side of his eye and saw Henri approaching with a basket. She offered cookies to him and his father. He gratefully took one, knowing it would help his energy stay high for the rest of the day. This is delicious. Henri smiled. I just figured out how to get cookies to turn out perfectly over an open fire. I had a real oven at home, and I kind of miss it. Where was home? He asked, taking another cookie. Indiana. There is so much corn in Indiana. I was happy to see other crops growing during our journey. He grinned. We're from Iowa. Lots of corn there as well. Would you like a cookie, Mr. Williams? She asked. Pa took one of the offered cookies and bit into it. This is a wonderful cookie. You need to give my wife the receipt. I will. Henri looked proud of herself, giving more cookies to the men, and then wandering toward the ladies. Keep that one, Pa said. She's a hard worker if she was willing to climb down that hill to bring you a treat. And she can bake. Chapter 3. Henri walked toward Roy's mother and sisters. When she reached them, they were all working on chinking the floor. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you all might like a cookie. Mr. Williams asked me to give you the receipt. Mrs. Williams looked up at Henri and smiled. I hear my boy is courting you. Henri nodded. He is. He's sweet. You're right about that. Girls, let's wash our hands and we'll try the cookies. The five of them sat on a blanket that Henri brought along, hoping Roy would have some time to sit with her. As they all tried her cookies, Mrs. Williams smiled. I suppose I won't need to worry about whether you're a good enough cook for my son, will I? Henri laughed. You don't need to worry about that at all. Are you all chinking the floor? I would love to help for an hour or two before I go back to cook supper for my family. She'd already baked 4 loaves of bread, and she would just make a thick soup for supper. They were all working in much colder conditions than they had planned. That would be wonderful, Mrs. Williams said. Are you sure your family doesn't need you? My father doesn't let me help with any of the men's work. He said no one helps me clean or do the wash, so I shouldn't be helping them. Besides, we have 4 men to do the work. 2 of my brothers are content to share a cabin this winter, and the 3rd brother wants his own. So that means 4 men building only 3 cabins. That sounds easier than what we're doing, Emma complained. I don't want to have to get so dirty doing this, she said, waving a hand at the half-finished floor. Oh, but won't it be nice when it's all done, and you can look at it and say, I helped build my family's cabin. Emma shrugged. I guess. But my hands will be covered with sores tomorrow. Who will want to court me with my hands looking ugly? Mrs. Williams shook her head at her daughter. The men who have made this trip don't expect their women to have clean and uncalloused hands. They understand that true work leaves its mark. I'm sure every man in our settlement would prefer that you have marked up hands. Henri nodded. You should look at my hands. Very calloused. I even took one of my brother's axes this morning and chopped down a small tree for firewood, and I then split the wood myself. I think being someone who will work is so much more important than being someone with pretty hands. I never thought of it that way, Emma said. Now what can you tell me about your oldest brother? Henri laughed. He's a good man. A hard worker. Someone who will make a wonderful husband and father one day. Emma smiled. Now that's the kind of information I was looking for. Henri worked with the women for a full 2 hours before heading back to her father's camp and putting soup on to go with the bread. Her brothers seemed to go through a lot of bread, and she would keep making anything they would eat so they could work faster. At supper, she served the soup, bread, and cookies. I baked cookies today as well as bread, she said. Bastian grinned, nodding. It's all delicious. I'm going to need 5 dozen of these cookies for myself by Sunday. Henri shook her head. I could make 6 dozen for the church raising though. But then you'll have to share. He sighed dramatically. You should be baking things that you know I love just for me, he said, frowning at her. Find yourself a wife if that's what you want. I'll teach her to bake my cookies. Pa changed the subject then. We chopped enough logs for the floor and walls of our cabin today. More than enough if truth be told. Tomorrow we'll dig the cellar, and Saturday, we'll lay the floor and chink it. I could chink it, Pa. I was helping the Williams family with their floor chinking today. Her pa narrowed his eyes at her. You weren't raised to do men's work. I know I wasn't, but Roy's mother and sisters were doing men's work, so I joined them. We had a lot of fun. She looked at her brother Jared. I do believe Emma Williams is sweet on you. Jared smiled. I thought so. I'll have to talk to her pa about courting her soon. But I won't marry her until my cabin is built. You should talk to him at the church raising on Sunday. I hate that we have to miss an entire day of work for the church raising, but I guess we wouldn't be working on the Sabbath anyway. At this time of year, I think we would. God isn't going to be angry if we make shelter for our families, Bastian said. Very true, Pa said. I'll bake cookies for that day. What else should I make? Henri asked. Venison stew? Samuel asked. You make venison stew better than anyone I know. I'm happy to make it, but someone has to get a deer tomorrow if I'm going to. Bastian nodded. I'll hunt in the morning. I could use a little relaxation. Henri shook her head. Only her brother would think using a rifle to kill a deer would be relaxing. Thankfully they lived in an area where there were lots of deer. Early the next morning, Bastian walked into camp with the deer wrapped around his shoulders like a scarf. Sam ran to help him tie the deer upside down in a tree. Henri smiled. Now I can make venison stew. I'll make a huge pot. It would be fun to go to the church raising, and Henri was looking forward to it. She wondered if she could band with the Williams ladies, and they could work on chinking together. Before you all go off to work after breakfast, could someone tote a few buckets of water to me? I need to do the wash. Samuel nodded. Sure. Jared and I can do that since Bastian got the deer so quickly. Thank you. I'll wash everything, including our Sunday best. Maybe Bastian could string a clothesline for me between the wagon and the closest tree. Bastian nodded. I'd be happy to. Pa yawned. We're digging the cellar today, so I expect everyone to help me with it. We will, Pa, Jared assured him. As soon as they'd had their eggs and bacon for breakfast, Samuel and Jared fetched water for her, and Bastian tied the clothesline. Pa sat resting a little longer before they started. His boys could do a lot more work than he could. That was certain. Henri gathered all the laundry that needed washing and got out 2 huge pots. One for wash water, and one for rinsing. She pulled the scrub board from the back of the wagon. Wash days were the hardest for her since her mother had passed. They'd often cooked together, but she and her mother had always done the wash together, and it was strange to do it on her own. As soon as her brothers were back from the creek, she put a pot onto the campfire for wash water. Then she'd do the rinse water, and she'd wash the dishes with whatever was left. Her brothers and her pa spent the entire morning digging the cellar, and then they laid out the logs for the floor. "Please let me help with the chinking, Pa," Henri said. "One more pair of hands can only make the process go faster." She shivered as she offered. Pa nodding grudgingly. "I guess you can. We need to get you in a nice warm cabin as soon as we can. You're not as big as the rest of us, and you don't stay warm like we do. We probably should have stayed in Oregon City for the winter. But then we wouldn't be in Clover Creek starting our lives." Henri would have been sad if they'd stayed in Oregon City and had to pay to stay. Here, they were on their own land and were able to stay for free. Pa smiled at her. "But your ma would still be with us." He still had a sadness in his eyes that made Henri want to cry every time she saw it. He would be alone for a long time, if not for the rest of his life. "I know, Papa. I wish she were here too. There are so many chores that feel like she should be beside me when I do them." Henri walked to her father and wrapped her arms around him. "I wish I could bring her back for you." "So do I, Henri. So do I." Working together with her brothers and father wasn't nearly as much fun as working with the Williams ladies. The four of them had laughed and joked the entire time, telling silly stories about things that had happened on the trail. The men were a great deal quieter and more focused on the job than the other group had been. Henri wasn't certain if men were naturally quieter while they worked, or they'd just run out of things to say to one another. Her family had always loved spending time together, and it seemed as if they'd had too much of togetherness. They were finished with the chinking by supper time, and Pa smiled at Henri. "We wouldn't have gotten it done today without you. I'll go fix supper for us. We'll be in the woods, chopping more trees. I think we can get some walls on this cabin tomorrow," Pa said with pride in his eyes. As the four men traipsed off into the wooded area beside them, Henri started a simple supper. They'd all grown fond of Johnny cakes on the trail, so she made Johnny cakes with bacon and eggs for supper. It was a filling meal that didn't cost much and was quick to make. She knew her father and brothers would be happy coming home to anything she cooked. She looked around her. She was already thinking of Clover Creek as home, and they didn't even have walls. This plot of land was going to be a great place to live. She just hoped her pa remembered she wanted her window overlooking the whole valley. What better way to wash dishes than to look at something beautiful while she did? While they were finishing up supper, Roy joined them. "You have more cookies?" he asked, looking around. Henri shook her head. "No, Bastian ate them all." "Well, that wasn't very nice." "I'll bake a bunch more for the church raising," she said softly. "I'd like that a lot." "I'll fight you for them," Bastian said. Pa shook his head. "No fighting over cookies on my watch." He looked at Roy. "How's your cabin coming?" "We're working on my family's cabin first, and we started on the walls today. We'll have to chop more wood in the morning, but I think we can have a roof on it by the end of next week." Roy looked at their cabin. "Are you starting on walls tomorrow?" "We are. We have the wood we need for this cabin and then one more. We've been chopping and trying to get most of that done, and then we'll finish this first cabin and start the second. We're only doing one cellar, so the other two should go up faster." Roy smiled. "That sounds good to me. Won't it be nice when we can all sleep indoors again?" As he talked, he moved his hands just enough that his arm brushed against Henri's. "Henri helped with our floor yesterday. She did a great job chinking it with my mother and sisters." "Yeah, she did a good job for us today, too," Pa said. I was impressed that she could work that hard. Henri laughed softly. You think chinking is hard work? Let me introduce you to laundry. Roy looked at her for a moment, trying to decide if she was joking. He saw the deer hanging not far from camp. Oh, that's a big one. Who got the buck? I did, Bastian said. I want Henri to make her venison stew for the church raising, so I had to get her a good-sized deer. He gaped at the sheer size of the animal. Would you use it all for one meal? Henri shook her head. No, I'll use some for the church raising, and I'll dry some for the winter when it's hard to hunt. That sounds smart. I just can't imagine that much meat used for one meal. Well, it's possible, but I only need to take the amount of food that would feed my family. But she'd take more. Her mother had always taught her to make at least half again as much as she thought she would need. Then she would never have too little. I may salt a little of it. Then I can make stew again. Bastian nodded emphatically. I don't know how or why, but Henri's a better cook than our ma was. I'm more creative with seasonings. That's all. Henri didn't want anyone to think she was better than her ma at anything. She pulled the cake she'd made while waiting for the clothes to dry out of the back of the wagon and served everyone a piece. Roy's eyes lit up as soon as he saw the cake. Her brother Jared took the first bite. Oh, this is terrible. Don't even try it. I'll take care of the whole cake, so Henri doesn't have to be embarrassed. Roy looked at his cake, then looked at her pa and all her brothers who were eating as fast as they could, and he knew better. He took a small bite, and a smile crossed his face. This is delicious, Henri. Thank you. My brothers always try to get the whole desserts by saying it's awful. If they say that, it means it's delicious. Henri rolled her eyes at her brother's antics. I'll keep that in mind. I can't believe you can bake this well. Roy was thrilled to be getting a woman who could cook and who wasn't afraid of hard work. Well, he hoped he'd be getting her. He had to have that cabin built first. Did all of you get your own land? Bastian answered for everyone. We did. We're building one huge ranch. All of us will work for it, and we'll split profits. That sounds good. I'm doing the same with my pa. We're excited to get started. We are too. Samuel said. I can't wait until spring when we'll have calves. I know it will be Henri's favorite time of year. She loves baby animals. I do, Henri said. I like human babies as well. That's probably good, Bastian said with a grin. I don't know what we'd do with you if you hated babies. Stop, she said to Bastian, knowing he never would. She just didn't want him to tease her in front of Roy. Roy grinned at her. They're your brothers. They're supposed to tease you. Do you tease your sisters? She asked. Well, sure, but there's only one of me and 3 of them. I don't think I could ever tease them as much as you get teased. That's true. We're both outnumbered by our siblings. Samuel looked at Roy. I hope you're not planning to steal our sister from us. We need to eat. I'll teach each of you to cook one meal. Then you will have 4 meals you can make, and you can rotate them. Henri knew they'd protest, but she thought it was a good idea. That's not a terrible idea, Pa said. I think every man should be able to cook a meal or 2. Jared looked at his father. You can cook? Pa nodded. I can cook pancakes and I know how to make a meat and gravy, and mashed potatoes. I could live the rest of my life on what I know how to cook. So, I'll teach each of you to make a breakfast, and each of you to make a supper. One person can cook each day, and what's left can be served for the noon meal the next day. We're going to take you up on that, Pa said. Teach each of us to cook 2 meals, and we'll feed ourselves all winter. Who do I get to teach laundry to? She asked. Bastian shook his head. Forget that. You're doing our laundry until your dying day. Chapter 4. Roy and his father had some of the walls up by Saturday evening. They'd even gotten the loft built. The only thing left to do was roof it, but they had shelter as it was with the loft there. The walls for the loft weren't yet up, but they could make that happen the following week. Sunday was the church raising. A week from Monday, they would be able to start on Roy's cabin. It was supposed to take longer than that to build a cabin, but they both worked from sunup to sundown, and they had worked as hard as they could, doing everything the way they thought was most efficient. His ma wasn't thrilled with how small the cabin was, but she knew Pa would be building her a house next summer. If he could do it around ranching, of course. But Roy was certain they could do it before and after ranching. They were used to hard work. His house would probably have to wait a full year, but that was all right with him. He and Henri wouldn't need a lot of space anyway. There was no stove, so Ma would have to cook in their fireplace, which she and her daughters had helped with, but she was used to cooking over an open fire now. When he woke Sunday, Roy was excited. Yes, he'd still be building, which wasn't his favorite thing, but they would be building with friends, and he would get to see Henri all day. It would be wonderful. His family drove to the church together. It wasn't far, and they certainly could have walked, but it was nice not to have to. When they arrived at the church building, he jumped from the back of the wagon and took some of the food his mother had brought to share. Nothing would be hot by the time lunch rolled around, but that was fine with him. He still got to see Henri. He was already working to help stack the rocks for the fireplace when he spotted Henri with her entire family. The boys all jumped out of the back, and Bastian walked around to help her down. Then she distributed food for her brothers to carry inside. Bastian carried a huge pot and put it on the table where they were setting the food. It was covered, but he sure hoped it was her venison stew. His mouth was already craving it. Henri came to him with a basket and handed him one of her cookies. He grinned at her. "I hope you brought a lot." "Oh, trust me, I did. I made 2 dozen to stay at home, 6 dozen for the community, and 2 dozen for me to walk around feeding anyone I want to feed. You know, like you." Roy grinned. "I think courting you may be one of the smartest things I've ever done." She smiled. "I sure hope so. One more cookie before I offer to others?" "I would like that. Thank you for thinking of me." "Oh, don't worry. I never stop thinking of you." Giving him another cookie, she wandered over to his father and offered him a couple. "If my son doesn't marry you, I'm going to adopt you so you can bake for me every day." Mr. Williams grinned at her. Henri laughed at that. "I suppose we could do that, but I think I'd rather just marry your son." She held out the basket. "One more before I move on?" "Absolutely." Henri had never been one to really involve herself in the things the others were doing along the trail, and right then, she could see she'd made a mistake. There were kind, loving people whom she hadn't even bothered to get to know. She would need to now that they were all settling together. She walked around the floor of the church, which had been accomplished that week, and she offered each man working a cookie or 2. When she was finished, she sought out Roy's sisters and mother. "Hello, Mrs. Williams. Emma, Abigail, Barbara." Henri smiled sweetly at the women she hoped would be her in-laws very soon. "What's in the basket?" Mrs. Williams asked. "My husband said he'll never speak to me again if I don't get the receipt for the cookies you made the other day." Henri giggled. "That's what's in the basket, and your husband has already had 3. Mrs. Williams sighed. "If I didn't know how hard he was working today, I would scold you for ruining his lunch, but I do know he's going to need snacks throughout the day, and he'd prefer your cookies to the jerky I brought. I really do need to make sure all of you ladies can make these cookies." Henri looked at Emma. She needed to be the first person she taught, as she had a feeling she would soon be married to Jared. "We'd love to learn," Emma said softly. Henri had noticed that when there were men around, she was always soft-spoken. When the men weren't there though, she was loud and boisterous. Henri was glad she didn't have to decide how to be in any situation. She was always just herself. "What are the women doing to help?" Henri asked, knowing that the others had been there longer than she had. "Chinking, and that's about all. We'll serve the noon meal, and we all brought food. I think we're just supposed to mingle for the most part." Hannah, Pastor Jed's wife, wandered over to them. "How are your homes coming along?" Mrs. Williams smiled and nodded. "We're staying indoors now. The men will finish the walls on Monday, we hope, but they built a loft for the girls to sleep in, so we have something over our heads." "Oh, that's wonderful," Hannah said before turning her attention to Henri. "And you, Henrietta?" "The first cabin has some walls. Just a little more chinking, which I've been doing rather than take any of the men away from the work. Bastian and Sam plan to share a cabin, so theirs will be the next they work on, but Pa thinks it'll be midweek before he can even start on theirs, and then Jared hopes to be married before winter sets in. So after they do Sam and Bastian's, they'll build Jared's. What about yours?" "We've decided to just build a bigger church for now, and Jed and I will live in a room partitioned off from the rest. The fireplace on the other side of the church is where I'll be doing my cooking." "That sounds good," Mrs. Williams said. "I'm glad you'll have a roof over your head this winter, especially with the baby coming." Hannah patted her burgeoning stomach. "The baby is what matters." "I couldn't agree more," Henri said. She was so excited at the idea of having babies, it was hard to think of anything else. "My kitten just had her first litter. Would any of you like a kitten to be a mouser? I'm sure we're going to get a lot of mice from these fields all around us." "I would," Henri said quickly. Her father wasn't a fan of kittens, but she had a feeling she could convince Roy it was a good idea to keep the mice away. "Great. I'll introduce you to them later, and you can choose your favorite. They won't be ready to go for 6 weeks or so, but I want them to go to people who will love them. I will love a kitten so much." Henri wanted to jump up and down with excitement. "After the men are done building the fireplaces, we women will be chinking." "Do you all know how to do that?" Hannah asked. All 5 of them nodded. "I learned from Mrs. Williams and her daughters." Henri had to give credit where it was due. "I heard Roy was courting you, is it true?" Henri blushed but nodded. "He is." "I hoped it was true, and I wasn't causing a problem by listening to gossip. I prefer to know if what I've been told is true or not." Hannah smiled at Henri as she left the small group and moved on to the next group of ladies. Henri smiled. "I do think she's going to be the best pastor's wife in the whole world." Mrs. Williams nodded. "She's sweet, and she's always willing to help however she can. I know that Jed is proud of her. I hope she's still able to do what she needs to do when the babes start coming." "I think she will," Henri said. "She's never been one to shirk hard work." Emma immediately changed the subject. "I see your brother Jared," she said to Henri. "Ma, do we have any treats I can offer him?" Mrs. Williams nodded. "We do. I brought my buffalo jerky that we made on the trail. I've been complimented on the spices I use many times. It will be good for keeping energy up." "Oh, good. Where is it?" Emma asked. "In a basket in the back of the wagon. Make sure you offer it to all the men and not just Jared. He doesn't need to know you're sweet on him." Henri hid a smile. Her brother was just as sweet on Emma as she was on him. "I'm sure he'll be thrilled to have something to snack on while he works." Soon, Hannah came to them and assigned the group of ladies to one of the fireplaces. "You said you know how to chink. We have some mud mixed up in a bucket beside each of the 2 fireplaces." Henri was thrilled she could be of use, thanks to the Williams ladies. Walking to the fireplace Roy had been working on, she smiled at him as he went to a new task. He turned and watched her walk away, causing him to stumble into his father. "Roy, get your mind off the girl and on your work. You can't be distracted on a work site." His father shook his head. "What are you thinking, boy?" Roy was a little surprised his father didn't cuff him on the side of his head. He deserved it. Both men went to help with getting the logs for the walls ready. There would be one window in the pastor's quarters. They joked that it was so people wouldn't be distracted during church, but they all knew the truth. It took more time to cut out windows, and it was time they didn't have if they wanted all the building done before it snowed. Besides, none of them had glass for windows, so they were just covering them with oilcloth, which could be rolled up out of the way when you needed air or wanted to look out. When it was time for lunch, the ladies all stood with their own meals, and Roy looked up and down the line for Henri. As he watched her, she removed the lid from her pot, and he could see that it was indeed a stew, and he could only pray it was venison. Each family had brought their own bowls, utensils, and plates that they could wash at home later, after the work was done, so as soon as the prayer was over, he hurried over to Henri. "The food looks delicious. And you look beautiful." She laughed, holding up her arm where some mud had landed on the old dress she'd chosen to work in. "I look ridiculous. I need a bath." He smiled. "I like it when you're a little messy." Blushing, she shook her head. "You're a silly man, Roy Williams." He shrugged at her. "Is this the venison stew Bastian couldn't quit talking about?" "Yes, it is. I made more for home, and I even made you a little pot of your own if you like it. If not, I'm certain Bastian will eat it all for you." "I'm sure he would, but he's not getting the opportunity." He looked around and realized he was holding up the line. "Oops, I'd better let other people try your stew." She smiled as he walked in one direction down the line, but she knew he'd missed out on some delicious meals when he'd walked straight to her rather than go down the entire line as he was supposed to. Henri stayed where she was, scooping up generous portions of stew for the men who came through the line. There was little left when it was time for the women to eat, and she wanted to sample some of the other women's cooking, not her own. So, she fetched the tableware she'd brought for herself, and went through the line to try things that were left over. Once her plate was filled, she found her way to Roy, who had saved a spot for her on the bench where he was sitting. "Where did these come from?" she asked. "While most of the men are working on the church, there's a small group working on making pews for the church. They're just going to be made from logs for now, but it's a place to sit. Most of the benches are done after the work put in this morning, and then those men will be able to help build the walls." "Do you think you'll be able to get the roof on today?" she asked, looking at the clouds that looked like they were about to dump a lot of rain or snow on them. She was thankful her father and brothers had worked so hard to get the walls mostly up on the cabin. With the loft in place, she would have shelter from the rain even before the roof was on. "I think we will. There are too many of us working not to." "That'll be good. Hannah doesn't need to get sick this close to her due date. I love this stew. If you really made a small pot just for me, I'll take it. My father will soon be insisting that you teach my mother and sisters all your receipts." "I think your stew is all he got." He spooned another bite of stew into his mouth. "No, I saw him get biscuits too." She hoped his father enjoyed the food. In her mind, his father could tell him not to marry her if her cooking wasn't good enough. Roy obviously thought it was good. He had a little line of stew on his chin, but she didn't tell him. She thought he looked adorable with the food she'd cooked in the middle of his beard. Roy looked over at her as she ate food his mother had made. "What do you think?" She shrugged. "It's pretty good." "Do you make a potato soup?" It was one of his favorite things, and if she didn't make one, she'd have to learn from his mother. "I do. Mine is different, but I do make one." He leaned close and whispered, "Is it better than Ma's?" I wouldn't say that, she said, though hers was much better. She was almost happy that his mother wasn't a wonderful cook, because it made her look so much better. I have a feeling it is better. You're a wonderful cook, but my ma is just mediocre. I didn't realize how little talent she had for cooking until I went on the trail and sampled other meals. Don't say that to her, please. She doesn't need to have her cooking compared to mine. My brothers all told Ma they liked my food better, and she was sad for a few days. Then she decided she'd just be proud that her daughter was a good cook. I won't say anything to her about it. He looked over at her and couldn't help but fall a little more in love with her. She was so special to him already. As soon as I finish my cabin, I plan to ask your pa for your hand. Her smile seemed to light up the gloomy day. I would adore that. And Pa says I'm to teach my brothers to each cook a breakfast and a dinner. Then they can all take turns cooking, and I don't have to do it. I think that's a great idea. Pa and I are going to start on my cabin a week from Monday, if we can stay on schedule. So far, it's going much faster than we expected. How long do you think it will take you? She asked, looking forward to calling the man beside her husband. My cabin isn't going to be nearly as big as Ma and Pa's. We'll use their cellar for the storage we need, so we don't have to dig a cellar. We don't need a loft, because we don't have children. Even if we had a baby by the end of summer, we sure wouldn't be putting it in the loft. Very true. Henri was so excited at the thought of marrying him. If you need help with the chinking, just let me know. I've found I really enjoy it. Ma and the girls will probably chink our cabin. We're all working together on both, he said. You just teach those brothers of yours to cook. I plan to. He frowned for a moment. I just realized that if Emma and Jared marry, he is not going to be happy with her cooking. She's not as good as Ma. I'd be happy to teach her to make all his favorite dishes, she said. I'm looking forward to having sisters. I have to say, I look forward to the idea of brothers. A bell rang, and they both knew it was time to get back to work. She wished they'd had more time to sit alone together in a crowd. They could have a private conversation, but her pa wasn't worried they would do something they shouldn't. She put her plate into the back of the wagon with Pa's and her brothers. She'd wash them that evening. For now, it was time to get back to work on their house of worship. Chapter 5. Roy visited for at least a few minutes every day. He and Henri sat together in church 2 Sundays later, and she invited him to supper. I'd like that. We eat at 6. I'll be there. He looked up and down the road to see if anyone was looking at them, and he squeezed her hand. He didn't know why he worried because the entire community knew they were courting, but to hold her hand in church. He just wasn't sure if that was proper. Henri was thankful that the cabin was finally built. Her father and brothers were still building every day, but she'd done what she could to make the house cozy. There were curtains at the one window that looked out over the valley, which was in her kitchen. The entire kitchen was the fireplace she used for cooking, a basin, and a table and benches. The table and benches were what her brothers had built for her in the evenings. One of the legs on the table was a little shorter than the others, so she had a wad of linen tucked under it to keep it stable. They'd even sanded the benches so no one would get splinters by sitting on them. Her loft was comfortable with a mattress on the floor. She hoped she wouldn't be living up there long, but she knew she may. As she made supper that evening, she kept thinking about how it would be the first time Roy had eaten an entire meal she'd cooked. She made 10 loaves of bread. As the bread was rising, she cut out dumplings for chicken and dumplings. It was the one meal she'd craved more than any other on the trail. Bastien had done an afternoon's worth of work for a neighbor, who had paid him in chickens, so she was able to cook the dish she loved so much. Her father and brothers were out building the cabin for Samuel and Bastien. They would start on Jared's as soon as Sam and Bastien's was done. Jared was only one person for the third cabin, so he had to wait while they built the other two. She had already cooked the chicken and deboned it. She'd never been a fan of deboning chicken, but she certainly knew how. As she worked, she heard the door open behind her. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw it was just Bastian. "Where are the others?" "I wasn't feeling quite right, so I came back here early." "Do you need me to do anything for you?" "I could brew some willow bark tea." "What will that do?" he asked. "The Indians use it to bring down fevers." Bastian nodded. "All right. I'll drink the tea." That's when she knew he wasn't feeling well. Her mother had taught her a trick for when her brothers and Pa were sick. Offer them some medicine. If they accepted it, they were truly sick and felt terrible. If not, then they were exaggerating their symptoms. It was simple, and she knew it would help her when she had children of her own. She heated some water in the metal coffee pot and then poured it into a mug for him, over the willow bark leaves. She didn't know where her mother had heard of the remedy, but she was glad she knew how to make it. And they'd collected medicinal herbs all the way along the trail. Her ma had been much better with medicines than any other woman she knew. While Bastian drank his tea and ate the cookie she gave him, she started making the bread. She made it in an iron skillet, which made it look strange, but over an open fire, it was the best way to bake bread. After the bread was done, she put the broth from boiling the chicken earlier and the chicken back over the fire. As soon as it was boiling again, she dropped in her dumplings. Bastian groaned. "That smells so good." He sniffled. "I can't believe I can smell it through this messed up nose of mine, but I can, and I can't wait to eat my share." Henri grinned. "I'm glad you love my chicken and dumplings so much that you worked for these chickens." "Oh, please. We were all wanting it the whole time we were on the trail. Ma made good chicken and dumplings, but there's just something you do that makes them taste so much better. I hate when you compare me to Ma. She was better than me in every way, and I'll always fall short." Bastian slowly shook his head. "You've always been better in the kitchen than Ma. Sure, she made her remedies that did help us, but she couldn't cook anywhere near as well as you do. And I'm sure you can make all the remedies now as well. Ma made me a receipt book of her remedies. I will always treasure it." She seemed to feel so much more about their mother's death than anyone else in the family. She wasn't sure if it was because she was the only daughter or because the men hid their feelings. Just before 6, there was a knock at the door. She hurried to open it, seeing Roy standing there, hat in hand. "Am I too late?" She smiled. "I'm just about to put supper on. I need to warn you, Bastian is feeling a little under the weather." Roy shook his head. "I'm not worried. He would risk getting sick if it meant more time with Henri." She opened the door wider so he could come inside, and he looked around the cabin. "This is nice." Bastian nodded. "We built it with our own 8 hands." Roy's lips quirked. "Whose are you building next?" He sat down on the bench opposite Bastian. "Mine and Sam's. Jared has to wait, 'cause he's only one person." "Well, he is courting my sister." "He is. But he still must wait. Sometimes you must not be first at everything." Roy grinned. "I can see that." He shook his head. "As the oldest, my sisters complain that I do everything first all the time." Bastian nodded. "But I'm happy to say that my sister was making my favorite food already, and it's good for when you're sick." "Something smells really good," Roy said, looking at Henri standing over a pot and stirring. "What is it?" "Chicken and dumplings. One of our neighbors in Indiana was from the South, and she had always had them. Ma got the receipt and then she taught me," Henri said. "But Henri's are better than Ma's," Bastian said. Henri gave her brother a look, letting him know that she didn't appreciate the comparison to her mother at all. Her father and other two brothers came into the house then, and Roy stood up. "May I speak to you alone, sir?" Paul looked exhausted, but he nodded and stepped right back outside. Henri wished she could hear what the two men were saying, but they'd made the cabin too well. She couldn't hear a single word. She thought about rolling back the oilcloth from her window, so she could hear them, but she knew better. Pa would not be happy with her. By the time Roy and Pa came back into the house, she had supper on the table. She'd sliced the shallow loaves of bread and put out fresh butter for it. And there were bowls filled with her chicken and dumplings. Roy sat beside Henri, and her brothers kept giving him goofy grins. Bastien looked like he was going to say something rude at one point, so Henri kicked him under the table. "Ow! Don't kick me. I'm sick." "Sick in the head," she mumbled. Roy chuckled but didn't say anything. He was enjoying the family dynamic a great deal. It was always fun to eat with someone else's family and see how they did things. This family seemed to make jokes a great deal more than his did. As soon as supper was over, Roy got to his feet. "Would you walk with me?" he asked Henri. She frowned, looking at all the dishes she still needed to do. "You can do the dishes when you get back," Pa said. "Walk with Roy." She was surprised to hear Pa say that. Usually, he was against her being alone with Roy even for a moment. "Yes, Pa." She wanted to walk with Roy, but she knew the dishes would be harder to wash the longer she waited. She grabbed her coat and followed him outside, surprised at how very cold it was at night. It was much warmer during the day. Roy took her hand and walked around the side of the house with her because he knew her family wouldn't be able to see them there. "I just asked for your hand in marriage, and your pa said yes. My cabin is finished, and we can marry as soon as you're ready." Henri grinned. "Are you going to ask me?" Roy chuckled. "Henri, will you be my wife?" "I would be honored." She stepped toward him and raised her lips for his kiss. Maybe her pa wouldn't approve, but kissing should be all right when they've decided to marry. Roy didn't think twice, wrapping his arms around her and kissing her softly. "How would you feel about going to the church in the morning and getting Pastor Jed to marry us?" "That would make me very happy. I've already taught my brothers to make 2 meals each, so they should be mostly self-sufficient. I will probably still have to bake bread for them." "That's fine. You know I don't mind if you see to your family's needs. We've already talked about it." "I know. I just feel like I should be a full-time wife and not a part-time daughter, so I wanted to make certain you were all right with it." Henri was glad he didn't seem to have a problem with it. "You are doing what you need to do for your family." "I feel like I always will." "That's fine. I wouldn't even mind if you made them supper a couple of nights per week to help out." "I may do that," she said. "I'll pick you up in my wagon tomorrow around 10. Will that give you enough time to see to your chores first?" She nodded. "I'll bake lots more bread for them, and probably even have supper going. They'll be much happier if we ease them into things." Inside she was floating on air. Finally, she was going to marry Roy Williams. She loved him and nothing was going to stop her. He walked her back to the front door, kissing her one more time before leaving. "I'll see you in the morning." "I can't wait to be your wife," she said softly. When she walked into the house a minute later, her pa asked, "When's the wedding?" "He's picking me up at 10 tomorrow morning. I'll make bread in the morning before I go, and I'll make a thick stew for you to reheat for supper. Will that help you?" Pa nodded. "I don't think I'm quite ready to eat something one of these 3 has learned to cook." "If you eat with your eyes closed, you won't see how burnt it all is," Henri recommended. That earned her a glare from Bastien, who seemed to be feeling better after the willow bark tea and the meal. "I can make what you showed me. I'm going to be the best cook around." Henri simply smirked at him, not willing to argue. She quickly washed the dishes with the water she'd put on to heat before supper. When she finished, she hung her apron on a peg on the wall. She had thought about packing it for her move to Roy's cabin, but it made more sense to keep it out for when she cooked supper in the morning. "I'm going to put myself to bed," she said. It was already after 8, and there were things she felt like she must do before she could marry her sweetheart. "Good night," Pa called. Her brothers echoed their father. "Sleep sweet," she called as she climbed the ladder. "I love you all." When she got upstairs, she changed into her nightgown and pulled her best dress from her pile of dresses. There were only 4, so it wasn't hard to find. She packed the other dresses, including the one she'd been wearing, and made sure she was leaving nothing behind. She wished she had a trunk, but there wasn't one, so she made do with a pillowcase. She'd had a trunk in Indiana, but it had been too heavy for the oxen to pull, and it would take up precious space they needed for food. As she climbed into bed, she closed her eyes and dreamed about how blissful married life would be. She could already see herself with a baby in her arms. Life would be wonderful. She woke before the sun the following morning, as was her habit. She carried the pillowcase with all her belongings downstairs with her, and then she hurriedly mixed up a huge batch of bread dough. While the dough was rising, she started a fire in the fireplace and started on a stew for supper the next night. Bastian had gotten another deer on Saturday, so she was able to make a huge pot that would last for at least a couple of days. While the stew cooked for a while, she mixed up pancake batter. Everyone would be pleased with her pancakes before Sam started making his. She had a feeling Sam would let them burn every time. She was just taking the stew out of the fireplace and putting the pancakes in when Bastian came out. She looked at him. "How are you feeling?" He shrugged. "Not great, but not too bad either. Would you like me to make you some more willow bark tea?" "No, thanks. I don't feel bad enough for it." Henri smiled. "Good. You're planning to work today?" "I am. I want to move out of this tiny cabin into the tiny cabin I'll share with Sam. Of course, with you gone, I could just stay in your loft." "You're welcome to it. I'll be living happily ever after in the cabin that Roy built for both of us." Bastian nodded. "Who should I marry?" he asked. Henri shook her head. "Why would you think I had an answer to that question? You know the women in the company better than I do." "That may be true, but I still can't decide whom you should marry. I can't see inside your head. There has to be someone." Henri sighed. "Perhaps you should look around at church on Sunday and see if any of the young ladies suit your fancy. I'd be happy to introduce you as soon as you were ready." "That doesn't sound like a bad idea. I'll try that." "Good," she said, turning her attention back to the pancakes. The first 4 were done, so she put them on a plate and started the next 4. Bastian was all too willing to grab the 4 of them and add butter and syrup. She continued to cook until her other 2 brothers and her father came out of the bedroom. All 4 of them had been sleeping there. She knew when she left, her brothers really would take over her loft. After making herself a couple of pancakes, she sat at the table with her family. "I will bake bread before I go. I have already mixed up a stew and started it cooking. I would wait and put it in the fireplace around 5 this evening if you want it to be hot. There's plenty of fresh butter for all of you. Let me know if you need anything else, and I'll make sure I do it." Pa looked at her. "Will you still do our laundry?" "At least until all the cabins are done." "Of course, I will. I'll come up and do it every Friday, and I'll probably bring our laundry as well." "That sounds good," Pa said. "It's going to be awful quiet without you here, humming as you go about your work. Just like your ma did." Henri smiled at her father. "I miss her every day." Pa nodded. "I know you do. I'm sure she's watching over all of us." After breakfast, she did the dishes, and then she scrubbed the floors one last time. By the time Roy had arrived, the cabin was in perfect order, and she had a stew slow cooking over the fire. 10 loaves of bread spread out over the table. They wouldn't have to cook for a day or two, and she would bake more bread on Wednesday. It wouldn't be a difficult chore, because she would be baking bread for herself and Roy anyway. The men were out finishing up the second cabin when Roy picked her up. She put her meager belongings into the back of his wagon. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her eyes filled with excitement. "Definitely," he said. "We'll be married before noon." "We will. My ma invited us to have supper with them Friday night. I thought it might be nice for you to have a night off cooking." She laughed. "I've already baked 10 loaves of bread and a huge pot of stew, as well as breakfast for my father and brothers. I would love a day off cooking soon." He chuckled. "Ma's trying to make it so you don't have to cook." "I guess that's just not possible. I love cooking. Maybe your ma is someone who dreads it, but I'd rather cook than do any other household chore." "I can understand that. Especially since you're so good at it. Ma loves to sew as much as she hates to cook. At least we all have mended clothes. After the trail, I'm surprised any of the clothes we brought from Indiana don't have to be resewn entirely." While they talked, he drove them down the hill to the church. "The pastor knows we're coming. Mrs. Scott will be there to witness the wedding. I'm surprised your ma won't be there. She thought it would be insensitive because your ma can't be. That's the one thing I miss the most on my wedding day. My mama should be there crying,